The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 21. The Spiritual Aim and Life. The true and full spiritual aim in society will regard man not as a mind, a life, and a body, but as a soul incarnated for a divine fulfillment upon earth, not only in heavens beyond, which after all it need not have left, if it had no divine business here, in the world of physical, vital, and mental nature. It will therefore regard the life, mind, and body neither as ends in themselves, sufficient for their own satisfaction, nor as mortal members full of disease, which have only to be dropped off for the rescued spirit to flee away into its own pure regions, but as first instruments of the soul, the yet imperfect instruments of an unseized, diviner purpose. It will believe in their destiny, and help them to believe in themselves, but for that very reason, in their highest, and not only in their lowest or lower possibilities. Their destiny will be, in its view, to spiritualize themselves so as to grow into visible members of the Spirit, lucid means of its manifestation, themselves spiritual, illumined, more and more conscious, and perfect. For, accepting the truth of man's soul as a thing entirely divine in its essence, it will accept also the possibility of his whole being becoming divine, in spite of nature's first patent contradictions of this possibility, her darkened denials of this ultimate certitude, and even with these, as a necessary earthly starting point, and as it will regard man the individual, it will regard too man the collectivity, as a soul form of the infinite, a collective soul myriadly embodied upon earth for a divine fulfillment in its manifold relations and its multitudinous activities. Therefore it will hold sacred all the different parts of man's life, which correspond to the parts of his being, all his physical, vital, dynamic, emotional, aesthetic, ethical, intellectual, psychic evolution, and see in them instruments for a growth towards a diviner living. It will regard every human society, nation, people, or other organic aggregate from the same standpoint, subsouls, as it were, means of a complex manifestation and self-fulfillment of the Spirit, the divine reality, the conscious infinite in man upon earth. The possible Godhead of man, because he is inwardly of one being with God, will be its one solitary creed and dogma. But it will not seek to enforce even this one uplifting dogma by any external compulsion upon the lower members of man's natural being, for that is nigraha, a repressive contraction of the nature, which may lead to an apparent suppression of the evil, but not to a real and healthy growth of the good. It will rather hold up this creed and ideal as a light and inspiration to all his members to grow into the Godhead from within themselves, to become freely divine. Neither in the individual nor in the society will it seek to imprison, wall in, repress, impoverish, but to let in the widest air and the highest light. A large liberty will be the law of a spiritual society, and the increase of freedom a sign of the growth of human society towards the possibility of true spiritualization. To spiritualize in this sense, a society of slaves, slaves of power, slaves of authority, slaves of custom, slaves of dogma, slaves of all sorts of imposed laws which they live under rather than live by them, slaves internally of their own weakness, ignorance, and passions, from whose worst effect they seek or need to be protected by another, and external slavery can never be a successful endeavor. They must shake off their fetters first, in order to be fit for a higher freedom. Not that man has not to wear many a yoke in his progress upward, but only the yoke which he accepts, because it represents, the more perfectly the better, the highest inner law of his nature, and its aspiration, will be entirely helpful to him. The rest buy their good results at a heavy cost, and may retard as much as, or even more, than they accelerate his progress. The spiritual aim will recognize that man, as he grows in his being, must have as much free space as possible for all its members to grow in their own strength, to find out themselves and their potentialities. In their freedom they will err, because experience comes through many errors, but each has in itself a divine principle, and they will find it out, disengage its presence, significance, and law as their experience of themselves deepens and increases. Thus, true spirituality will not lay a yoke upon science and philosophy, or compel them to square their conclusions with any statement of dogmatic religious, or even of assured spiritual truth, as some of the old religions attempted, vainly, ignorantly, with an unspiritual obstinacy and arrogance. Each part of man's being has its own dharma, which it must follow and will follow in the end. Put on it what fetters you please. The dharma of science, thought, and philosophy is to seek for truth by the intellect dispassionately, without prepossession and prejudgment, with no other first propositions than the law of thought and observation itself imposes. Science and philosophy are not bound to square their observations and conclusions with any current ideas of religious dogma, or ethical rule, or aesthetic prejudice. In the end, if left free in their action, they will find the unity of truth with good and beauty and God, and give these a greater meaning than any dogmatic religion, or any formal ethics, or any narrower aesthetic idea can give us. But meanwhile, they must be left free, even to deny God, and good, and beauty, if they will, if their sincere observation of things so points them. For all these rejections must come round in the end of their circling, and return to a larger truth of the things they refuse. Often we find atheism, both in individual and society, a necessary passage to deeper religious and spiritual truth. One has sometimes to deny God in order to find him. The finding is inevitable at the end of all earnest skepticism and denial. The same holds good in art. The aesthetic being of man rises similarly on its own curve towards its diviner possibilities. The highest aim of the aesthetic being is to find the divine through beauty. The highest art is that which, by an inspired use of significant and interpretive form, unseals the doors of the spirit. But in order that it may come to do this greatest thing largely and sincerely, it must first endeavor to see and depict man and nature and life for their own sake, in their own characteristic truth and beauty. For behind these first characters lies always the beauty of the divine in life and man and nature. And it is through their just transformation that what was at first veiled by them has to be revealed. The dogma that art must be religious or not be at all is a false dogma, just as is the claim that it must be subservient to ethics or utility or scientific truth or philosophic ideas. Art may make use of these things as elements, but it has its own svardharma, essential law, and it will rise to the widest spirituality by following out its own natural lines with no other yoke than the intimate law of its being. Even with the lower nature of man, though here we are naturally led to suppose that compulsion is the only remedy, the spiritual aim will seek for a free self-rule and development from within, rather than a repression of his dynamic and vital being from without. All experience shows that man must be given a certain freedom to stumble in action as well as to err in knowledge, so long as he does not get from within himself his freedom from wrong movement and error. Otherwise, he cannot grow. Society, for its own sake, has to coerce the dynamic and vital man, but coercion only chains up the devil and alters at best his form of action into more mitigated and civilized movements. It does not and cannot eliminate him. The real virtue of the dynamic and vital being, the life Purusha, can only come by his finding a higher law and spirit for his activity within himself, to give him that, to illuminate and transform and not to destroy his impulse, is the true spiritual means of regeneration. Thus, spirituality will respect the freedom of the lower members, but it will not leave them to themselves. It will present to them the truth of the Spirit in themselves, translated into their own fields of action, presented in a light which illumines all their activities and shows them the highest law of their own freedom. It will not, for instance, escape from scientific materialism by a barren contempt for physical life or a denial of matter, but pursue rather the skeptical mind into its own affirmations and denials and show it there the divine. If it cannot do that, it is proved that it is itself unenlightened or deficient, because one-sided in its light. It will not try to slay the vitality in man by denying life, but will rather reveal to life the divine in itself as the principle of its own transformation. If it cannot do that, it is because it has itself not yet wholly fathomed the meaning of the creation and the secret of the avatar. The spiritual aim will seek to fulfill itself, therefore, in a fullness of life, and man's being in the individual and the race, which will be the base for the heights of the spirit, the base becoming, in the end, of one substance with the peaks. It will not proceed by a scornful neglect of the body, nor by an ascetic starving of the vital being, and an utmost bareness or even squalor as the rule of spiritual living, nor by a puritanic denial of art and beauty and the aesthetic joy of life, nor by a neglect of science and philosophy as poor, negligible, or misleading intellectual pursuits. Though the temporary utility even of these exaggerations as against the opposite excesses need not be denied, it will be all things to all, but in all it will be at once their highest aim and meaning, and the most all-embracing expression of themselves, in which all they are and seek for will be fulfilled. It will aim at establishing in society the true inner theocracy, not the false theocracy of a dominant church or priesthood, but that of the inner priest, prophet, and king. It will reveal to man the divinity in himself as the light, strength, beauty, good, delight, immortality that dwells within, and build up in his outer life also the kingdom of God, which is first discovered within us. It will show man the way to seek for the divine in every way of his being. Sarva Bhavina, from the Gita, and so find it and live in it, that, however, even in all kinds of ways he lives and acts, he shall live and act in that, in the divine, in the spirit, in the eternal reality of his being.